Hello and welcome to our presentation. Today's presentation will thematize the regulation of home working and handle a comparative approach in between Russia and Spain. To allow for some insight into our presentation, here's our table of content. We will start off with Spain's approach, continue with the Russian approach, and then round it off with a comparison and the concluding remarks. So let's get started with Spain's understanding. First of all, where is it regulated? Well, Spain has established its regulation on home working not long ago under Ley 10/2021 de Trabajo a Distancia, in which it manifests essential aspects surrounding the concept of home working. Here, the three aspects of crucial importance are the scope, the definition, and the purpose. Well, concerning the scope or the applicableness of the regulation, it applies to workers who work remotely for at least 30% of the day within a period of 3 months. Turning to the definition of it, one has to underline Article 2 of the regulation, in which it is stipulated that remote work concerns work, excluding occasional work, that is being fulfilled from the employee's home or another preferred location, for all or part of the working day. Well, this brings us to the purpose and the idea behind the regulation. In focus of it is, of course, the protection of workers as a weaker party and the guaranteeing of equal treatment and opportunities and non-discrimination. This is of huge importance as under the Spanish approach, home workers are to be understood as normal workers, thus declaring them to have equal rights in every single aspect. This entails everything from possibility of promotion to holidays to salary and so on. Of course, one may not forget the importance of the employer in this relationship, as he is also a protected party under certain aspects. So let's look at the key elements. And let's focus on the core obligation, the heart of the regulation. Well, this heart of the regulation is the new law, the central law, which is an obligation of the employer and the employee to enter into a written agreement, setting out the remote work conditions, which are found in the compulsory clauses, which I'm going to introduce to you now. Well, here you have various clauses, such as the location of the remote workplace itself, an inventory of equipment and tools, the duration of the remote working agreement, agreed working hours, and when the employee will be available, the proportion of work that will be carried out remotely or in office, the procedure in the event of technical difficulties, the control over the employee. So will there be used any software to track progress and time? Of course, hand in hand with this goes data protection, which is very important nowadays. The right of the employee to disconnect is also of huge importance, as here, work-life balance has to be strictly separated, as the employer is forced to ensure that his employee is disconnected between the two. Then we have expense reimbursements, which is also very important aspect, as here remote working law provides that the employee must be compensated for any expenses related to the equipment and tools he uses, which can go as far as internet and electricity usage. Then finally, health and safety in the remote workplace. Well, the employer must perform a risk assessment of the working environment, although here the burden of responsibility is on both parties. So as you can see, the employer also has certain rights he can claim. And yeah, so as you can identify through under this regulation, this regulation values a severe protection of workers, of home workers in Spain, setting them equal with the normal workers. Well, now I will pass the floor to my colleague Ruslan, who will elucidate the Russian approach to home working.
Thank you, Leo. And now I would like to tell you about the approach to the regulation of home working in Russia. We're going to talk about the definition of home working in the law, who it applies to, and its purpose. To begin with, it's worth saying that the regulation of remote work in Russia, as well as in Spain, is a relatively new round in the development of labor regulation, which is a response to the coronavirus pandemic. The state issued a law to protect employers and employees in difficult conditions and accelerate adaptation to the new realities. In December 2020, the Russian Federation enacted the federal law on amendments to the labor code of the Russian Federation in terms of regulating remote work, which introduced remote work into the labor code. The question arises, how is the concept of remote work defined in the law, and to whom does this law apply? According to this law, distant work is a performance of job function as defined by employment contract outside in the employer's location and the office on a regular basis under an employment contract. Such work must be performed by information and telecommunication networks, including the internet and other public communication networks. Therefore, this law applies to all employees doing tasks online for a continual basis, away from the work office of employer or factual unit. Since we have understood the definition and scope of the law, I would like to move to the key aspects of the regulation of home working in Russia. The main goal of lawmakers was to protect employees and employers at remote work and equalize their rights with ordinary employees and employers. To begin with, we will look at the provision of law that protects employees. The first one, the location of the remote workplace is not fixed, which gives absolute freedom for the employee to work where it's convenient. It definitely protects employees' rights and freedoms. The length of home working can vary and be negotiated between the employer and employee. This is either a temporary transfer to the distant work, which lasts 6 months, or should be a permanent transfer to this working regime. Also, authorities are entitled to decide the urgent transfer of employees to remote format of work. This rule was introduced in order to respond to global disasters and pandemics and to protect both employees and employers in a timely manner. Employer must pay all the expenses for home working instruments. This is a reasonable provision that reduces the cost of employees to prepare for the new conditions of work. Concluding the analysis of the Russian approach to the regulation of home working, we'll look at the articles of law that protect the employer. So first of all, the control and surveillance over the employee is allowed, but with certain restrictions. So the employer, even if his employee works remotely, can monitor his performance. In Russia, there is no right to disconnect. The reasonable overtime work is allowed and should be paid accordingly. This provision of law allows for more frequent contact with the employee and increases the efficiency of the work. And if the work cannot be properly done distantly, employee can be suspended from working and he'll receive 2/3 of his salary. This provision of the law protects employers in an area where the distant working is not possible and allows the payment of reduced wages to employees. The contract can be terminated if the employee does not interact with the employer for more than 2 consecutive days after the date when he receives the distant working request. If there is no valid reason as a major illness or something else. In other words, if employee fails to show up and refuses to perform work, the employer can terminate his contract and fire him. To conclude our research, I'll pass the floor to my colleague Majid, who will make the final comparison and conclusions.
So essentially, in conclusion, I will discuss some similarities and differences between Russia's and Spain's home working systems, rights, and obligations. Firstly, the rights for a teleworking individual are extremely similar within both countries' systems, with compulsory obligations for both countries' home workers equivalating to the same. Moreover, home working cannot be a basis or reason for a salary reduction. The main difference that can be seen for Russia is that the Russian Federation dictates that employees must be provided with the necessary equipment, programs, or pay rent for such equipment. Another main difference is if the work due to its specific duties cannot be done remotely and the employee cannot attend the workplace for any reason, such as a pandemic, hurricane, or force majeure circumstances, the employee is entitled for compensation, and that compensation equates to 2/3 of the initial salary. And the employee is suspended from working in distance or face-to-face format. So to conclude, both home working systems are quite modern, and both countries' law systems have adapted to the demand of home and remote work perfectly, with the creation of new laws and regulations to adapt this.